bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry again. Whoever believes in me, I know my sheep, and my sheep I have come down. Just as the Father knows me, I will do what he sent me. If you follow me, the bread, you won't have to walk in darkness. You will have the way, truth, and life. I know my sheep, even though no one can come to the Father. Whoever lives and believes in the light of the resurrection and life. This is the living now.
For me, over the past number of years, one of the things that I've really enjoyed is getting into skiing. It's something that I never thought I'd ever get into, but over the past number of years, I've had the opportunity to go several times, and for me, it's just the perfect getaway. I mean, you have these amazing mountain sceneries that you look out on, and it's just like nothing I've ever seen before. You have this amazing food, and then you have these cozy fire-lit evenings, and that's before you even get on to the adrenaline you get, where you send yourself down a mountain at silly speeds, maybe not Gwyneth Paltrow speeds, but silly speeds nonetheless, on two planks of what effectively feels like wood, going down a mountain. I love it. And over the past few years, I feel like I've got fairly confident going on these pisted runs. I mean, there's not really a piste that I'd shy away from all that much. But a couple of years ago, my friend Joel, who's a far better skier than I am, suggested that we go out off-piste. I mean, it was a day where there was just loads of fresh snowfall and it was beautiful and powdery and the whole mountain looked amazing. And he said, why don't we go off the back of the mountain where there isn't a track? And for those of you who don't know, this is just like a different game when it comes to skiing. It's like you have to have a different technique and you have to be pretty fit to be able to do it. You have to really know what you're doing, otherwise you can get yourself in some pretty bad trouble. But nonetheless, despite not really having much experience in this, I thought this guy knows what he's doing. I'll follow you, I'll go where you go. So we went off the back of this mountain and I kind of really found it pretty difficult. It wasn't like skiing that I'd done before, and you're kind of exposed a lot more because there's not really the boundary markers that you're used to, and the snow feels really different, and you can be in like this waist deep snow. And then all of a sudden I found myself skiing on this bit of the glacier where some of the snow had been blown off by the wind, before falling in to this what felt like 5 foot deep load of snow. And I felt myself just cartwheeling forward and forward and forward. I felt my skis pop off, and then I let go of my poles, and it was just like I was completely helpless. I started spinning over and over again. I found out later that they call it tomahawking. You know, when you throw an axe into a tree and it spins over and over. That's what my body was doing. It was kind of like completely helpless and numb. And I felt my head just bashing against the snow over and over again. And eventually I landed the right way up, and despite it only probably being a few seconds, I can remember thinking, I'm dead, I'm dead, I'm dead, I am out of control. And I landed, and my first thought was, have I broken my back? And I hadn't. I was kind of beaten and bruised and pretty sore, and I took the rest of the day far more carefully. There's something about being out of control that's horrible, and you don't have to be exposed to the elements to know what that feels like. That feeling of helplessness, that feeling of there's nothing you can do but wait. I mean, have you ever been in a situation where you're waiting on someone's response, and it's kind of just one of those situations where you know that if you don't receive this message by like 5:30 for when the office closes, or when the postman drops off the letters, if you don't hear about it then, it's going to be another day until you hear about it. And if it's news that's important, if it's something job related, or messages from a loved one, or something that you're really anxious about, that night that you have to wait all over again can just feel all-consuming. It can feel just like it takes everything from you. Being out of control is not very nice at all, and you don't have to be a control freak to know it. And when that happens, it bubbles up within us, and it can often explode on those around us. If you've ever been around someone who's out of control, it can be a little bit disconcerting because sometimes they might say things that they don't really mean. So what do? We try and keep as in control as possible. We put money in the bank and passwords on our phones, and we put insurance upon insurance and investment upon investment, and alarm systems on our houses as well. And all of those things are fairly wise things to do. And in fact, actually, when you look into the Bible, it talks about actually there's a wisdom in being in control over the things that you are responsible for. I mean, right back in Genesis 1, we're told to rule and subdue the earth, and actually how that's kind of God's blueprint for the earth, that he wants us to stay in control of the things that he's given us responsibility for, that we need to be wise with those things. In Proverbs, it talks around how a man who doesn't have self-control is like a city without walls, and it's easy to be taken over by somebody else. And then in the New Testament, Paul, who's one of the early church fathers, he writes to this church in Galatia talking about how self-control is one of the fundamental elements that can be seen when you have an encounter with a personal presence of God. Control isn't always a bad thing. But here's the thing, most of us aren't in control of the things that we'd want to be in control of the most. I mean, think about it. If you could be in control of anything, your mind normally goes to the things that you can't be in control over. I mean, think of the health of others, or even your health, or the things that your company or job might do, or things that the government might do. All of a sudden it fills your life with a whole bunch of what if questions. What if that happens to them? What if that happens to me? What if the insurance doesn't pay out? What if this decision is made for me? And you're left with that sense of, I'm not in control. And it begs the question, doesn't it? Where do you go with the things that you're not in control over? I mean, many of us have mastered being able to control as much as we possibly can. Maybe you're not in that situation and you're worried about a whole bunch of different things. I mean, you're one decision away maybe of in about 50 different things. If one thing goes wrong, your life is going to spiral out of control. But maybe you're someone who has managed to control as much as you possibly can, and you're left only with the things that you really can't control, and it's those things that keep you up at night, knowing that you've done everything you possibly can and you're still not in control. Hey, where do you go? Where do you go with the things that you're not in control over? One of the things that a pastor called Francis Chan said that I love is that for him, when he grew up, he realized that in following God, every year the stakes went up when it comes to trusting God and trusting his faith. I mean, think about it, it's true, isn't it? I mean, there was perhaps a time where you didn't really have much to lose. When you were young and maybe you were healthy and you didn't really have a house, or you didn't really have much assets, and it was easy to kind of go where you want and do what you wanted and kind of just live the way that you wanted to live without much consequence. But for him, he said, whilst that was true, he was able to use that and utilize that for following God in all kinds of amazing ways. And he had this attitude of, hey, God, wherever you want me, I'll go. Wherever you want to send me, I'm going to go. Whatever you want me to do, whatever you want me to say, like, Jesus, I'm in. I can do that. And then he realized that, you know, he got this girlfriend and they started hanging out, and he realized that he was responsible for that relationship. And all of a sudden it was like, oh, okay, well, it costs a little more now to trust you, God. But okay, Lord, I'm going to do that. And then maybe he buys a house, and it's like, okay, well, now I've got this house and it's nice. But God, I'm still going to trust you with this, and maybe I won't go anywhere, but Lord, if it's around here, now I've got my house, then that's cool. And then he gets married, and it's like, okay, well, I'll do anything, but as long as you keep my wife okay. And then he has kids, and it's like, okay, God, I'll still follow you anywhere, I'll do anything, but if it can be around here, and as long as my kids are okay, and as long as my wife's okay, and you know, and then he gets a job, and his job's going pretty well, and it's like, okay, well, as long as my job's good, and as long as that's okay, and as long as what I've invested in is going okay, then Jesus, I'm gonna follow you. And you see what I mean? It's like every year the stakes, they go up. And if you're like me, you know that to be true. I mean, for me, I look at the time where I was just most all in, and I just had the most zeal, and it was probably when I was like 16 years old. And my faith's really good now, but all of a sudden, it's like when you start to have things to lose, and year on year on year, and right now I might be slightly wiser than I was when I was 16, and slightly more mature, and I have a little bit more experience, but sometimes I question, how much of that would I trade in to regain some of that zeal and some of that naivety that I had when I was like 16 years old? And it just makes me think. Every year, the stakes go up. Every year, it's slightly harder to trust in the one who says that he's going to have control over the things that we can't have control over. But this is something that God speaks into in some of the oldest stories that we have in the Bible, right early on with God's people who were once enslaved in Egypt, who lived in this land of oppression, of harshness, where every day they were caused to produce bricks and mortar and work in the land of Egypt for Pharaoh and these foreign gods who didn't really do anything. They were the ones responsible for making the world go round. And eventually God frees them from this oppression, frees them from this slavery. And there's this momentous moment that you'd have heard about where Moses is called by a burning bush and there's these plagues that happen, and eventually Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go," and eventually they're allowed to. And they go through this Red Sea and they see walls of water on each side, and they reach the other side. They find this freedom. They find this moment where all of a sudden they can follow the true living God, and they're going to go to this land that's been promised to them. And on their way through the desert, they find themselves out of control. They find themselves in a place that's not familiar to them. They find themselves on uncharted territory where they're not sure what's going to happen next. And this is what they say. When they were there, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. Moses and Aaron were the leaders of this nation, Israel. "If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt," they moaned. "There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread that we wanted. But now you have brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death." Now, you might read this story or have heard this story before, and you just think, how could these people just be so obtuse? Like, how could they be so stupid? Think about it. They've just had this experience where they've seen walls of water on each side of them as they've walked through the sea to escape this land of oppression. And yet here they are, after seeing this miracle, after seeing God's provision already wishing that they were back in this land of oppression. And we might think that that's kind of silly, but that's what lack of control does, isn't it? All of a sudden it brings us back to the place that we know was wrong, but at least we know what it's like. I mean, have you ever seen someone who perhaps has continuously gone back to a relationship that they know is bad for them, but it's kind of just better than the unknown? I kind of feel like that's maybe what it's like for them. It's like, hey, well, at least we knew what was back there rather than what's here. But they're there, they're grumbling, they're complaining to Moses and Aaron. But God replies. "The Lord said to Moses, 'Look, I'm going to rain down food from heaven for you. Each day, the people can go out and pick as much food as they need for that day. I will test them to see whether or not they follow my instructions. On the 6th day, they will gather food and they will prepare it, but there'll be twice as much as usual.'" And this is the idea that for one day of the week, there'd be a day where they wouldn't have to do any work, that they could just rest and have something that they would call a Sabbath. But God heard their cry in the wilderness and he provides for them. He gives them their daily bread. Each day it's going to come down literally from heaven and they can have enough for that day, but he tests them. You see, he says this isn't going to be like the land of Egypt. This isn't going to be the time where you're just going to go and try and get more and more and more without knowing when to stop, and you're going to have this excess of just in case food. I'm going to give you exactly what you need. This is going to be a relationship, a partnership where every day you can remind yourself that you can rely on me over the things that you actually have no control over. That actually this isn't just going to be reliant on you doing enough. That actually I'm going to be a God who's going to be able to provide for you when you need it. And God does this not because he's insecure, not because he wants to test them just to see if they're going to obey his instructions to make sure that he's a good enough God. Like, God's secure enough. But he does this for the sake of the people so that they might know something about themselves and that they might know that they can be vulnerable with God. And Moses and Aaron make this super clear in the following verses. They say, hey, listen, actually you're complaining to us, but your complaint isn't with us. It's not actually about us. It's even, however good a leader we are, then that actually we're going to be useless without God. Actually bring these prayers to God. God is going to be the one that's going to provide for you. God is going to be the one to make sure that everything is in its rightful place. And you think that's an amazing story and you think that it's going to end there, but it doesn't. You see, the Israelites continue to move on and they go to Mount Sinai where they receive the commandments from God. And again, they have this amazing encounter with the living God. And they go on from that place to this promised land. And again, whilst they're in the wilderness, they find themselves in a place where they have a similar complaint. You see that need for control, that need for pulling everything in towards themselves. It doesn't go away. In Numbers 11, it says, the rabble who were traveling with the Israelites began to crave the good things of Egypt. And the people of Israel also began to complain. Oh, for some meat, they exclaimed. We remember the fish that we used to eat for free in Egypt. And we had cucumbers, melons, leeks, and onions and garlic, all the stuff that we wanted, but now our appetites have gone. All we ever see is manna. The manna looked like small coriander seeds, and it was pale yellow like gum resin, and the people would go out and gather it from the ground. They made flour by grinding it with hand mills or pouring it into mortars. They then boiled it into a pot and made it into flat cakes. These cakes tasted like pastries baked with olive oil. The manna came down on the camp with the dew during the night. You see, for the people, it still wasn't enough. They started to process it in their own way. They tried to keep it for longer than it was supposed to be kept for. They failed at the test. They weren't able to rely on God in the way in which God invited them to rely on Him for. And actually, it doesn't end well for them. God kind of says, hey, well, have it your way. If this is the way you want to live, if you want to be responsible for the things that you're not in control of anyway, then actually you can live like that. And it doesn't end well for them. And you see, in these stories, it's like we're offered two different options. We're offered to live a story where we're not the center of it, where we can give up some of that control in order that God can be in control over the things that we don't have control of anyway. Where we can live in a way that we take what we have and we use it to follow Him in the way in which He wants us to follow Him. Where we can relinquish that control, where we can try and find peace in a living God who has eternal perspective. Or we can try and live our lives where we try and get everything together, and when we do that, we end up bending the world towards ourselves. We start acting with a little bit of injustice. We start doing things at the expense of others in order that we will be okay. It's not the way in which God intended us to live at all. He invites us to be vulnerable with Him. He invites us to trust Him. And you hear that story and you might think again, oh, what idiots. How can they live like that? Even after everything, even after manna comes down from heaven each day, how can they still not trust God? How can they still want to be back in Egypt? And I think that actually the people in Jesus' day, thousands of years later, they would have heard these stories and maybe thought the same as me and you. These idiots, like, how can they not understand this? But Jesus had a message when He was with people that actually played on this story a little bit, I think, that would ultimately challenge the people in the way in which God challenged those people all those thousands of years ago. And one of the events in John's Gospel goes like this. Jesus is traveling from one side of the Sea of Galilee to the other, and his fame's kind of getting known a little bit, and his message is being spread around, and this huge crowd comes round and gathers on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, just so that they can listen to him, just so they can find out about who he is. And Jesus sees this opportunity with the people who have come to follow him. Jesus soon saw a huge crowd of people coming to look for him. Turning to Philip, he asked, "Where can we buy bread for all of these people?" He was testing Philip because he already knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, "Even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough money to feed them." Then Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Hey, there's a young boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what good is that with this huge crowd?" I mean, it sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it? There's this big crowd of people who haven't got anything to eat. They're out of control. All they have is remnants from the place in which they've just come from. And maybe some of them are starting to question, hey, where are we going to go and get food? And Jesus, knowing what he's going to do, decides, just as God did with the Israelites, to put them to the test. He says to Philip, hey, what are we going to do? What are you going to rely on when you've got nothing left to rely on? What are you going to rely on when you're not in control? And then this happens. "Tell everyone to sit down," Jesus said. So they all sat down on the grassy slopes. The men numbered about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks to God, and distributed them to the people. Afterwards, he did the same with the fish. And they all ate as much as they wanted. After everyone was full, Jesus told his disciples, "Now gather the leftovers so that nothing is wasted." Again, it's just like with the people in Israel. Hey, I don't want there to be anything left over. Take as much as you need for that day. I'm going to give you just enough. And after this moment, all the people are just amazed, as you and I would be, that everyone's had just enough to eat and there's nothing left over. There's no waste whatsoever. And they're looking around for Jesus, and Jesus has kind of gone away because the people want to try and put him in this leadership position that they've crafted that isn't actually what Jesus came for. And Jesus goes across to the other side of the lake. And later the crowd come round and they find Jesus and they're like, Jesus, that thing with the bread and fish, it was amazing. Can you do it again? And Jesus, I think, gives them a response that they were probably a little bit disappointed with. Is like, that was just a sign. Like that was symbolic of something else. Like it wasn't supposed to be about the bread and the fish. Like the bread and the fish, they were symbols of something bigger. They were symbols of something eternal. This isn't just about something that fills your belly. This is something that sorts out your heart as well. This isn't just something temporary like bread. This is going to be something eternal. He says this, I tell you the truth, you want me because I fed you, not because you understand the miraculous sign. But don't be so concerned with the perishable things like food. Don't be worried about the things that you will try and seek control over anyway. Spend your energy seeking the eternal life that the Son of Man, which is Jesus, can give to you. For God the Father has given me the seal of approval. And they're like, okay, well, God, what do we do in order to do that? What works do we need to do in order to receive this eternal life? And Jesus is like, no, listen, you don't get it. It's not about what you do. It's not about trying to seek control. It's not about bending the world in towards yourself in the ways in which you know how to do. This is bigger than that. This is believing in me. This is believing that there's something more. Jesus told them, this is the only work God wants from you. Believe in the one who is sent. And they answered, well, show us a miraculous sign then, just as Moses did. And Jesus says, hey, listen, that wasn't Moses. You're missing the point. I mean, back in those days, God provided those things. It was God who gave them their daily bread. It was God who invited them to be vulnerable. It was God who invited them to trust with the things that they were vulnerable with, that they had no control over anyway with. And Jesus says, listen, I tell you the truth. Moses didn't give you bread from heaven. My Father did. And now he offers you the true bread from heaven. The true bread of God is the one who comes down from heaven and gives life to this world. This isn't just about food. This is something that's bigger than that. It's something eternal. It's something life-giving. It's something that's going to give you freedom from sin. It's going to be something that gives you redemption and salvation. That means that whilst you might be guilty, that you are not condemned. This is going to be something life-giving. This means something more. And they said, well, we want this. We want this bread every day, they say in verse 34. And Jesus replies, listen, I am the bread of life. All of that symbolic bread, all of the manna that came from heaven, all of that bread that you ate when you were on the hillside next to me that you were amazed by, it was all a symbol of something. It was a symbol that I can be the one who takes responsibility for the things that you're not in control of if you choose to trust me. If you choose to trust me, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will not be hungry. Whoever believes in me will not be thirsty, is what Jesus says. And the people, they go away disappointed. Jesus isn't who they wanted him to be. They kind of just wanted to see more of the miraculous sign like they were expecting. And they weren't really interested in this idea of really trusting and really following him. And you think, you idiots, like you've just seen something amazing. Like if I'd have seen that, I wouldn't have behaved how those people behaved. But you see, those people probably thought the same of the people back in Exodus, where they just thought, surely those people can't be so stupid. And I kind of just want to challenge us, because it's easy to follow Jesus when you create Jesus to become something that he's not. Where you kind of treat him as this optional extra, where you're willing to follow him when everything looks good, but when he actually asks you to follow him, you kind of just go back to settling with the things that you've managed to kind of put in place for yourself. You know, when you go to those worship nights and everything feels amazing and you know, and you feel the presence of God and you go away and you're like, yeah, this God is real, but actually nothing really changes. when you have, all of these different things, and and Jesus says, hey, listen, I want you to follow me by looking out for those in your neighborhood, and it might mean sacrificing a little bit of luxury, and it might mean sacrificing a bit of your time, and it might mean sacrificing some of your comfort, and it might mean sacrificing some of who you are in order that you might help those around you. Actually, all of a sudden, it's then like, okay, well, Jesus, I'm willing to trust you, but maybe not with this. Like, as soon as this is on the table, I'm kind of out. I'll come to church every Sunday and I'll hear a good lesson, and I'll go, and I'll do my part here and there. But actually, when it comes to it, Jesus, I'll kind of put you in your box over there, and I'll come to you when I'm ready. And Jesus says, actually, no, that's not what I'm about. I'm the bread of life. I'm everything. I'm going to offer you something eternal, and I want you to be all in. And the people, they walk away, and Jesus turns to his followers and says, well, what about you? And they say something profound. They're like, Jesus, we know who you are. Where else is there to go? Where else is there to go? Let me ask you, where in your life are you seeking control over the things that God is calling you to trust in? What are the things that you're looking to control, whether it's financially or relationally or whatever that looks like? What are the things that you're desperately trying to cling on to? And God's saying, actually, listen, I want you to give some of that up in order that you might know me, in order that you might be able to trust me a little bit. Maybe it's a mission or an adventure that God's calling and he's put on your heart, and actually it takes a little bit of a step of faith, but God's bringing you there. What is it that you're actually being invited to give up a little bit of control over the things that maybe you never really had control over anyway, in order that you can trust God? It's easy to kind of just see the mission part of it, to see the actual sacrifice part of it as this optional extra, but Jesus says, no, I want you all in. But when you're all in, it's better for you, because I want to offer you something eternal, something good, something forever. I am the bread of life.
Christ is my firm foundation, the rock on which I stand when everything around me is shaking.